Hello, everybody. We'll get started in a few minutes. Just bear with us. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our September all hands. Been a couple months. Been a nice break of what was the summer, a quite hot summer for most of the country. So today we'll get started with just sort of the political landscape a bit and go to Michael Lee, who's Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center, to give everybody a briefing on where we stand with redistricting. And from there, talk about TFC. You think after this long, I get it right. But TFC's 2022 plans, what we're doing about it, and how y'all can help. So with that, I will start with a bit of background that I imagine many of you have heard about before. But really, what we're seeing in 2021, after Democrats didn't make as much progress in 2020 as we all hoped, is that the GOP is activating decades of investment in passing extremist legislation. So from, it's really included three wonderful things here, but there's really so many. But voter suppression, I think Brennan Center said that 49 states have introduced legislation restricting the right to vote, and 18 states have enacted restrictions already. As far as choice goes, the terrible law that passed in Texas is expected to be matched in a number of different places in the coming months, especially should Texas continue to be successful. And as we'll go into with Michael, this is all taking place against the background of the 2021 gerrymandering and redistricting process. So three kind of stats sum it up, and there is some good news that I'll go into in a little bit later. We do have some assets, some advantages, but it's important to know that even though Biden won and that we currently have control of the US Congress, we still have 59 Republican state legislative chambers. We have the fact that Republicans only need 6 seats to flip the House. And some folks have estimated that due to various structural factors like gerrymandering, like incumbency, that Democrats basically need to outperform by just 2% or by at least 2 percentage points in 2022 to have any chance of really even retaining or treading water into the position that we have. Another way to think about it is because politics has become so nationalized that Joe Biden's approval rating needs to be in the 52, 53, 54% range for Democrats to have any hope of making positive progress in elections. So those, it's really important to remember, in our view, from what we do in states and in state legislatures about despite the fact that sort of the headlines were positive from the top of the ticket last year, there's quite a lot of work left to do, and a lot of scary things happening afoot. So Michael, are you with us?
I am.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just introduce you real fast and I can give you the screen share.
Sure.
So Michael Lee is Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center, a expert in voting rights, redistricting, and all the fun related topics related to that, and a widely published commentator on redistricting. And I'm super excited to have him just tell us what's happening. With that, I'll hand it over.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Greg, for having me here. And I'm glad to talk to you about the one thing that is going on. And I'm sure, like, when I used to do this, I used to have to sort of explain that this was happening. But now I think it's in the news increasingly. And I think people are increasingly aware that, the maps around the country are being redrawn now that we have the census data. And there are lots of course, wild stories about, already some of the shenanigans. Last night, Ohio passed legislative maps at midnight. They have a redistricting commission, but the way that it works, there are 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And so the 5 Republicans voted to pass a map that I think probably blatantly violates their own state constitutions and reforms adopted by voters. Like they're supposed to have seats be proportional, and they're to the will of the Ohio voters. But what they decided to do is figure out how many statewide races over the last 10 years Republicans won, and that's 13 out of 19. And they figured that's 81%. So it's okay if 81% of the seats are Republican, which of course is not how you generally do proportionality. Because of course, if you won all 19 races by 1 vote, you could get 100% of the seats. That's a totally disingenuous reading of the Ohio Constitution. So that's the sort of stuff that we're seeing going on. And other states are just beginning the process of redrawing legislative as well as congressional maps. And I think, we're just sort of in the early phases of this. And there's still, you think about it a little bit like a war, we're sort of like everybody's sort of posturing a little bit and kind of like getting ready. But, like the actual battles are going to come hot and heavy in just a few weeks, and it'd be over by early next year. But I do have a PowerPoint which I will run through to just to do some table setting, and I will try to share screen, which I think I can do after. So does that work?
Perfect.
Okay. Let me just get rid of this so you can see. Okay, so let me start the slideshow. Great. Okay, so redistricting, the good, the bad, the ugly. Redistricting takes place every 10 years after the census, but this redistricting cycle is going to be different in a lot of ways than ever before. And one of the big reasons is that the country has become more diverse and has changed quite a bit since last decade. One thing to start, the country grew by 7.4% last decade. It may seem like the country's growing a lot, but that's actually the slowest growth rate in the country's history, except for the 1930s. And so, the country's growth rate is slowing. And that's in part due to fewer immigrants, but also because the country is aging quite a bit. And so, that's the first fact that you need to know. But while the country's growth rate was slow, it was very uneven. And, a handful of states actually account for almost all of the country's population growth. As you can see here, Texas by itself had almost a population growth of 35 of the states. You add Texas and Florida and 16 other states, and that's all of the growth. Altogether, about half the country's population growth was in the South. And, much of the rest was in the West. States in the Northeast and the Midwest, while they didn't lose population, they grew very, very slowly overall. Ohio only added, for example, 200,000 people altogether. So, very, very slowly. And you see this reflected in a shift of congressional representation over time. It really is the South and the West that dominate Congress, the US House today. I think one of the most startling things, which, people have probably heard a lot about because it was quite so remarkable when it came out a few weeks ago, is that for the first time in the country's history, the white population of the country actually declined, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms, there are 5 million so fewer white people in 2020, or were 5 million fewer white people in 2020 than there were in 2010. Some of that is due to the people kept designating themselves as multiracial, 2 or more races, but a lot of that is just simply the white population in much of the country is actually decreasing. As has been the case for recent decades, Latinos power the growth. Altogether, Latinos and Asians accounted for about 74% of the country's population growth, which is really quite remarkable in a lot of ways. And not only are these groups growing, but they're also growing in places that are very unusual, or that that represent a change. So like take Gwinnett County just outside of Atlanta, that's Newt Gingrich's old home base. In 1990, Gwinnett County was 90% white. It's only about 35% white today. Fort Bend County, where Tom DeLay of Texas had his home base in Sugar Land, Texas, right outside of Houston. It also was about 90% white in 1990. It's only about 30% white today. And so, you know, these are like remarkable changes. And in both Gwinnett County and Fort Bend County, there is no racial majority. There's barely a plurality. And so, you know, it's about 24% Latino in Fort Bend, you know, 20% Asian, you know, 19% Black, and you know, so it's very mixed up. And so this is sort of in a lot of ways the future of America. But as we'll talk about, you know, that creates a lot of redistricting challenges as maps get redrawn. Communities of color have had a lot of success in these counties in winning power. So in Gwinnett County, in 2020, they elected a Black sheriff. They elected a Chinese American woman to the state Senate. A couple of years before that, they elected an openly gay Korean man to the state house. They elected a Latina to the state house. But all of those, in a lot of ways, could be at risk in redistricting for reasons that we'll talk about. The increased diversity of the country also plays out in the electorate, right? But a little bit less so because, you know, a lot of people of color still are children under 18 and still have not yet joined the electorate. But so last decade, people of color were most of the increase in eligible voters, although there was some increase in the white share of eligible voters. So let's talk about the redistricting landscape now. So I titled this "The Good, the Bad, the Ugly." Let's start with the good or good-ish. But the first is that there have been a lot of reforms to the process since maps were last redrawn. In particular, Michigan and Colorado adopted independent commissions, which are strong and well-designed. Michigan was a really badly gerrymandered state. It will not be this decade. Other states adopted, you know, other types of reform. New York and Utah and Virginia adopted advisory commissions that draw maps for the legislature's consideration. Ohio adopted a really complicated set of reforms, which, as I led off with, may be challenged in court because they seem to be blithely ignoring the reforms, but nonetheless, it is a reform. As I mentioned, altogether, 4 states will have independent commissions. You know, California, Arizona, joined by Colorado and Michigan. So, you know, a lot of progress in fixing the process. There also are states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, which are better this decade, simply because they have Democratic governors who can veto maps. So that's a huge win. But let's talk about the bad. The reality is that single party control is a reality in most of the country. In most of the country, legislatures draw maps subject to governor veto. And in most of the country, one party controls that whole process. And so, you know, it's not, you know, it's kind of an ugly, it's an ugly process. If you look at them, there's a lot of red there, right? You know, altogether, Democrats control the drawing of 75 congressional seats. Republicans control the drawing of 187. So a very lopsided disadvantage in favor of Republicans, not as quite as much as the decade before when Republicans controlled 213, but still a very lopsided disadvantage. The same thing applies really to the legislative maps around the country as well. So that is, you know, something that is bad. And you see on there, I put Ohio in red because it, again, you know, it is a state that even though they have a redistricting commission, Republicans can do what they want because they have 5 out of the 7 seats. And so, I think, the environment in a lot of the country is tough. And, Ohio's a perfect example. You see a lot of decisions made behind closed doors, a lot of, smoke-filled room stuff. In Ohio, just, they have an open meetings law. So if the commission met as a whole, they'd have to like do it in public. But instead, what they did is they went two at a time in a back room. And as one person came in, one other person came out. So there's a lot of sort of like, the smoke-filled room stuff still survives in much of the country. And, you'll see that as maps get rolled out and, already states are well, we'll talk about this in a second. So let's talk about something ugly, some of the threats to redistricting. And Greg has already mentioned some of this. One is the Supreme Court has given a green light to partisan gerrymandering with its decision in Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019. And this is really, I think, particularly devastating in the South, where there is racially polarized voting and where last decade, Republican legislatures tried to pack Black voters into districts and claim that the Voting Rights Act make them do it. And the Supreme Court rejected that, so that is not what the Voting Rights Act requires. It does not require you to stick every Black voter into a Black district. But this decade, they can pack Black and Latino voters into districts and simply claim we were discriminating against Democrats. And look, the Supreme Court have said it's perfectly fine to discriminate against Democrats, and the fact that they happen to be mostly Black and brown in our states, so be it. But we're not discriminating against them on the basis of race. We're discriminating against them on the basis of partisanship. And that, of course, has a really devastating effect to communities of color, particularly these suburbs that I talked about, like in Fort Bend and Gwinnett, where people of color are starting to elect candidates, starting to be really effective at all levels of government. You can really dismantle those districts, and there's not a whole lot. And if you claim that it's a party label, then you're really in a lot of ways good. There also, and this hasn't quite played out yet, although it might. We think that there might be some gerrymandering of or attempt to change how the electors are designated for the electoral college so that it's by congressional district. A couple of states already do that, but of course you could imagine if you do that in a gerrymandered state, you can create some lopsided disadvantages, right? And like, for example, last decade, North Carolina, a 50-50 state, the map was drawn to have 10 Republican districts and 3 Democratic districts in a 50-50 state. So if they had allocated electors by congressional district, you'd have 10 Republican electors and 3 Democratic electors, right? And so this is an increasing thing that you're starting to see, particularly in states that Democrats can win, right? They're not going to do that in North Carolina because Republicans probably think they have a good shot at winning all, everything. But in Wisconsin, that's something that could unfold in the coming year or years. Greg already mentioned this: 16 states maps will be drawn without key protections of the Voting Rights Act. This was really important in 2011, but this will no longer be the case. Let's see. Likewise, I talked about reforms. There is a possibility that Republicans will try to attack redistricting commissions in one way or the other, either to claim that redistricting commissions are unconstitutional or to argue that some of the rules that they apply are unconstitutional. There is a rumor that they will attack community of interest requirements. Many commissions are required to keep communities of interest together. Republicans are going to attack that as like a code for like drawing race-based districts without meeting the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, and will challenge that as violating the 14th Amendment and claiming that the Constitution requires more colorblindness than that. So I will end just by saying, I had a really dark presentation. I will end by saying, like, there still is hope around the corner, more hope than there was even at the beginning of this week. And that's because of the potential for federal reform. And there are 2 pieces of legislation. One is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, HR 4, which would restore pre-clearance coverage to states with a history of discrimination. And it would cover, we think, these states that are listed there: Alabama, California, Florida, and others, including New York. And so, it would, have a really big impact. But perhaps the more important one is the Freedom to Vote Act. And I left the word act out of it, but the Freedom to Vote Act, I had to change the name on this slide just because it's a brand new. This is a slimmed down version of the For the People Act, which you may have heard of, that Joe Manchin and Senator Klobuchar have worked on. And from a redistricting standpoint, it would ban partisan gerrymandering in congressional redistricting and strengthen protections for community color, would set uniform rules for how maps get drawn. It would significantly change how maps get litigated. These are just some of the things that it would do. It would create a rebuttable presumption that a plan is a partisan gerrymander if you have bias at 2 of 4 test elections using presidential and Senate results. If triggered, a state would be barred from using its map until the case was fully litigated. If the litigation took longer, it ran into the election, then the court would put a temporary map in place or move the primary. All partisan gerrymandering cases could only be brought in Washington, D.C., and appeals would go to the D.C. Circuit rather than directly to the Supreme Court. This D.C. Circuit would act as sort of the national circuit that hears redistricting cases. And there are a bunch of other technical changes that would happen, which would be really impactful. I mean, it sort of really shifts the dynamic and the risk for states, because right now states, if they draw a discriminatory map and it gets struck down, the rule is that they get a chance to redraw the map. And that's a problem because there's no incentive for them not to be really hyper aggressive. This creates some disincentive for them to be hyper aggressive. So, but of course, it depends on whether we're in a 51 or 60 vote world, which depends on what happens to the filibuster, and a lot depends on that man right there, Joe Manchin. That is Lady Gaga next to him at the inauguration. Some people think that's Kirsten Sinema. It is not. We'll see what happens on the filibuster. I think a lot of people are optimistic that they will figure out some path forward, but of course, everything that people can do to put pressure on both the Senate and on the Biden White House, frankly, who've been a little bit silent on some of these issues, would be helpful. So with that, I will stop. That's a very, very quick overview.
Thank you.
And
I have one question just myself. So for some reason, I thought when Manchin comes out with the slimmed out and kind of hopefully less objectionable bill, is that still require the filibuster to go away, or is there some implicit because he's doing this, it's sort of implying that he sees a path?
I think that there's a lot of debate about that. I mean, that Manchin was a big proponent of gun legislation, Manchin Toomey, which also got filibustered, and he did float the filibuster over that. On the other hand, I think that he has said a lot of the right things. He doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster, but he it's open to a talking filibuster, or changing sort of he said the filibuster should be painful for you. And so I think he said a lot of the right things, and I think I don't think that he would have put all the work in just to see something blow up. But he is right now going through the process of trying to talk to Republicans, talk to Mitch McConnell, hey, can you support this? It's unclear to me why he's necessarily doing it, but he feels a need to talk to them. And so the Senate, in Senate fashion, is going to run through its process. But, I think there is a lot of outside pressure, from funders, from activists. You may have seen people got arrested at the Capitol trying to chain themselves to office buildings and things like that, to say this is really important. And, and the message needs to come out, because the White House has said things like, oh, well, we need to start getting ready to organize, right? And it's you can't out-organize gerrymandering. You can't do it. Republicans have a built-in advantage, which is going to only grow right this decade. And so, they need to sort of hear from people that this is really important, and that, the redistricting cycle started. It's not too late to enact this, but, the clock is ticking. The states are enacting maps. So,
yeah. So two sort of related questions, but from Shay, one is, how can technologists resist gerrymandering? Are there opportunities where technology can play a role in resistance efforts, like making it easier to file court challenges? A somewhat related question that we also received was, is there mapping software that allows non-experts to essentially explore or play around and see how these dynamics play out?
Yeah, well, let me start with the second one.
Second one might be easier.
Yeah, there's tons of, that's one of the things that has changed. So technology has made gerrymandering worse, right? Because you can draw thousands of maps in a matter of hours. It used to be you would draw maps by hand. You draw 3 or 4 or 5 and pick the best out of the 3 or 4 or 5 that you drew. But now you can draw tens of thousands, and you can do so much more robust data about voters based on what you're posting on Instagram, where you're charging to eat, what kind of car you drive and all of that, right? People construct these very complicated models, right? So it's much easier to gerrymander than it was in the past. But on the other hand, technology is much more accessible. Just think about the phone you have today than compared to 2011, right? I mean, and so there are tools like Days Redistricting app. There's something called District which is like district with an R, not ER, but District R. All of which will allow you to draw maps, from the comfort of your home, or getting together with groups, or helping community groups draw maps and submit them. And that can be really powerful, right? It's a sort of a check on the process, because a lot of times, states will say like, oh, well, like we tried to draw a good map, but we are within the rules, we just couldn't do it. And sometimes, like in the past, student drawn maps have like actually influenced courts, because courts have been able to say, well, the student drawn map does better at doing what you say you're trying to do, and it doesn't have all this bias. And now that's even easier to do. Like that was in 2012. Now it's like it's much easier to do. So like it absolutely is something that can be powerfully done, and you can tell it stories on Twitter, through social media, in ways that you couldn't before. Reporters are ready to pick that up. And having said all that, I forgot what the first question was.
It is essentially an expansion on what you were just saying, which is how can technology play a role in resisting unfair partisanship?
Yeah, so I think there's also something called plan score, right? Which is if you go to planscore.com, you could upload the shapefile for any plan, and you can get back results like, is it biased or not, using all kinds of different metrics. And so there's just a lot of tools that are out there that I think really, and like this happened in Ohio, like they were releasing plans like at the, late at night, and people were like, I've read it through all these analysis, and like it has this many Democrat, like it's so much faster than it used to be. And you can sort of tell, you can kind of call them out in real time in ways that you couldn't. And so technology has been a bane, but it also could really be a help. So,
yeah. Has there been any movement on the public polling of how the public, is worried about gerrymandering, or?
Well, I do think if you look at the polling, like the public thinks that the gerrymandering should be banned. And if you look at like the reform efforts around the country, like 10 or 15 years ago, like redistricting, people's eyes glazed over. You ask them about it. Gerrymandering, maybe they kind of understood it, from school or something like that, but it didn't really move the polls at all. Now people will tell you, like if they're working on reform efforts, they go to door at very mixed partisan neighborhoods and say, we're trying to take power out of the hands of politicians. And Republicans will say, where do I sign? Democrats will say, well, where do I sign? I do think that it's an issue that has a lot of salience for people now, especially, and it probably will have more, as these maps get drawn, if they're really bad. I think there's a story to be told, but it's just so much more readily accessible. Historically, people thought about redistricting as like D's versus R's battle between inside the dome, and it got reported as mostly like a legislative story. And now it's a story of actual communities, how they're split apart, how this very fast growing, these very fast growing communities of color are being denied power, right? Or that they're whatever toehold they've gotten will be dismantled, right? And that's a really powerful story for people to be able to tell, and to tell visually using a lot of publicly available tools and other things. So.
Cool. And the last question would be, if the For the People Act passes Congress, what does that mean? Not only for the Congress, but also in state legislature, since that's the thing we spend a lot of time worrying about.
So we'll call it the Freedom to Vote Act.
Oh, sorry.
No. I've been doing this like for the last 2 days. And I will say, like they picked the name because it sort of pins off of like the freedom to marry, right? Which was like a really successful way of framing marriage equality, right? It was sort of like, oh, well, like, yes, so like that makes sense. We like freedom, right? And things like that. And so freedom to vote came kind of from that. But the Freedom to Vote Act only deals with congressional redistricting. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does have some redistricting changes that would apply, to all levels of redistricting, whether it's city council or Congress. And so that's, and that bill is on a slightly slower track. People think it'll pass maybe sometime this early winter. So
cool. Well, thank you so much. My
Yeah.
camera's not blank, but yeah, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, well, we can come back and do a mid cycle update after it's all over. So, but thank you for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Okay, see you.
All right. So the good and the bad and the ugly. So now we will go back to TFC. I can find there we are. So what now? That's kind of the big question. Gerrymandering, like Michael talked about, is somewhat of a tough pickle, and there's not always things we can do, even though we'd like to. But ultimately, the route to sustainable change is, yes, the courts, yes, it's public advocacy, but it's ultimately electing the right people in positions of power so that we don't have to do the other things. So that's what we care about. And so TFC for 2022, just a quick reminder on how we've architected ourselves, is that we really care about improving the effectiveness of democratic digital and at all levels of the ballot, state legislature, city councils, all the way up to the Congress and higher. And we've built for our upcoming cycle kind of 3 prongs of that effort. One is the volunteer services that you're all familiar with, which we get to execute high quality digital programs for campaigns at high scale and at low cost. One is an experimentation independent effort where we get to rigorously run experiments ourselves, randomized control trials and other methods to learn what's really working and then scale them, and then the technology to measure, facilitate, and help it all run. And so the kind of thing that for us unites all these efforts is really 3-pronged around a concept we call learning engine, which is both culture and technology around testing different marketing tactics, analyzing the results, and then with the ones that we want to, scaling them up, and ultimately getting the data from that back into the same place so that we can continue to test and analyze. So on the services side, we've worked with 18 campaigns so far this year in Virginia and piloted a message testing program, which is really exciting. For 22, we are excited to work with, we expect about 175 campaigns, although topic of the hour, redistricting is scrambling the map. And so it's a little hard to forecast right now where and when those will be, but we stand ready to assist when the maps are drawn. On the internal side, on the independent side, essentially voting rules, voting generally is becoming even more confusing at a time where reaching voters is actually trickier than ever. So we're actively embarking on a series of advertising experiments to push on what really works on what we learned during 2020, made even kind of more interesting as the changes in iOS 14 and 15 happen, where ad privacy is making it harder to reach an individual voter. And then ultimately going into our Vote by Mail initiative, which is a bleeding edge digital marketing program that can help mitigate some of those gaps by essentially bringing the right information about how to vote to the right person. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the program that we ran last year and what we learned from it. And then, that pivots into some of these experiments that we're planning on running. And so last year, we ran a large program that essentially recruited people to sign up to vote by mail, and then made our best efforts to make sure they did. So that was from Facebook. People go to a form. They presented with, basically they'd fill out a form saying what county you're in, give your phone number, email, all that kind of helpful information. They'd immediately receive a text message that would offer help with assistance, because one of the things that we really learned from early efforts was that a sort of hidden and quiet form of voter suppression is the forms. So when you don't have a desktop computer, when you have a slow computer, when you have a slow old phone, when you're not very good at maneuvering through computers, a lot of these forms become basically unusable. And that means that people cannot sign up to vote, to register to vote or to vote by mail. And so we had scores of people actually helping live with these forums, and it was a tremendous success. So we, through this program, ended up signing up 434,000 people to vote by mail. Just pass through the form. The final analysis that we completed a couple of months ago was that made a 9 percentage point increase, or it made for a 9 percentage point increase in turnout above baseline voting rates. And really important was that the signups were younger, they were less white, and they were less likely to vote than a lot of other efforts. And that's the part that we are going to basically double down on and try to do additional experiments this year about. So it's inside baseball, but a lot of traditional political campaign targeting works around coming up with lists of people. And once you have those lists of people, you call them, you visit them in person, you try to target them online, send them emails. It's very list centric. Those lists aren't very good when you are a person of color. They're not very good when you're young. They're not very good when you don't vote. And so the people that you can traditionally reach through these programs often are older, whiter, more Republican. And so this program, using some new probably not new to the commercial side, but unconventional in politics, ad targeting techniques and creative, actually was pretty successful in reaching that group, to the point that 1 in every 5 of the signups for this program didn't have any contact information available in one of the major voter files that the Democrats use. And when we looked at the incremental uplift of votes that we generated through this program, a significant amount of them were from people that didn't have that contact information available. And that's the really exciting thing that we're doubling down on this upcoming year. Another thing that we've learned out of that and multiple other experiences, and really that polling, took such a big collapse last year, was we're working on new message testing methods with partners that can bring accurate and low-cost messaging down to the states. So there's all this fancy stuff that gets used on commercial advertising and presidential US Senate races, but doesn't get used down ballot very much. And so we're able to pilot that successfully in Virginia this year, and we're anticipating bringing it to other states to help out. And again, all of this comes down to, it's great to do a program. It's great to show somebody an ad or get a donation or send a text message. In that time, it helps, all for it. But ultimately, if we're going to leverage all that activity for the most impact over time, we need to have essentially a way of retaining and creating a flywheel. So we call this the learning engine, which is the almost 700 projects that we've done to date, all the vote by mail efforts, other experiments. We're building out internally our data warehouse, our data acquisition pipelines, all the things to make sure that a Facebook ad that's about education looks, is identifiable as such, alongside a Snapchat ad that's about healthcare. And from there, we're looking to spend the next year or two really accelerating the production of best practice reports, training, and content around how to do digital the best. And that's what I think is the most exciting, in addition to all the sort of direct voter work that we're doing. So it all comes down to a busy cycle for us upcoming. Working now in Virginia, doing message testing, planning our experiments, building our data warehouse. But we look to really kick up the scale on that as Virginia wraps up in November. And we've been working hard on working with a number of state legislative caucuses in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan throughout this year in preparation. So just wanted to give that quick look. To do all this, we have a bunch of new folks joining the team, or have joined the team, and some really exciting people joining the next month. One, welcome to Lauren, who is joining us from TextOut, from NextGen, from the AFL-CIO as our new campaign director, to Jessica Sanders, who's our new data engineer, making the whole thing go. And we are actively hiring for our last remaining major rec this year, which is the head of development, which is the fundraising money side, or money kind of development non-engineering. So with that, the way that you can help, because there's always an ask. One, volunteer for 21-22. So if you're on our list, you probably heard a lot of the Virginia volunteer opportunities that are coming out this year. In our email next week is going to be a survey to see essentially who is in for 22, their regional preferences, the kind of work they'd like to do. And we'd really ask if you're interested to fill that out, because it really helps to give us a view into what the volunteer base is interested in doing, how we can best match that interest with campaign demand. The second, if you are so able, is to donate. All of this costs money, a lot of money, and it's really important to be able to fund this work, as all of us who do it every day know very well. So I think there are a few other higher leverage opportunities to give than TFC. We really take a lot of pride in making sure that every dollar that we give to gets spent well, and goes to goes to help as many people as possible. So volunteer, donate, support in any other way, refer a friend. We're all game. And with that, I will just say a big thank you. And I'll hang more questions. So Carl asks, why are younger voters hard to reach? The youth vote could overwhelm embedded instructional unfairness. Yes. So the core, I guess it's a big question of why young folks don't vote. If you ever look at like voting by age bracket, it's a pretty strong linear relationship up and to the right as the older you get. So I can't maybe answer that entirely, like it's essentially about why young folks don't vote, but I can say that there's some technical reasons why political campaign and political organization interventions like ad campaigns or door knocks or things don't reach younger people as effectively. One is that they just they don't have as much digital debris and history as a lot of older folks do. They're typically, oftentimes using pay-as-you-go mobile phones. And I live in an apartment complex where a canvasser can't actually go in to reach them. They just may not care. And that online, when you don't care and you don't click, Facebook and Google and Instagram and Snapchat are going to try to show you other stuff. So ultimately, I think politics is about connecting the right message with the right person, and there's always a better or more important way to do that. And what we can work on here is essentially finding the best ways to reach you on the online ad platforms. And it's up to the person whether that message aligns with them. So Steve asked, to what extent are we collaborating with or learning from other similarly aligned platforms like Civis or NGP Van? Or are we rolling our own on the full stack? So interesting question. We are collaborating and learning where we can, where it makes sense. NGP Van is the central, essentially CRM for the Democratic Party, both the fundraising and voter contact side. One of the projects that we're actually doing on the tech side is building a connector from an open source data pipeline tool into NGP Van. All of our current active email fundraising projects in Virginia, all 15 or 16 of them, use NGP to send their emails. So we meaning staff and our volunteers, are in NGP every day using that and using that to raise money for campaigns. And so that is an important thing that we're connecting with, because generally at TFC, we are very careful and judicious about when to build our own software. Oftentimes we are using completely off-the-shelf things like Facebook Ads Manager or Google Ads Manager or NGP, because that's what campaigns used to. That's like the commercial industry has invested billions of dollars into making those tools really good. And oftentimes the sort of like the the gap between how they can be used and what we need to do is often just knowing how to use it, or the best way to use it, or the best structural way to use it. So long answer, but we happy to connect to any platform, and really about sort of the thing that we're spending the most time on is the mix of how our projects intersect with that platform style data. Any other questions? I agree, TJ. It is awesome news on the NGP connection. We got it working, at least in the sandbox environment. So excited to test it on a real campaign soon. All righty. Yes, thank you. Is it? Oh, ironic. What's the data pipeline that is the source of that connection? It is the traditional NGP email API. Going through that, and then going into Airbyte, and then going into BigQuery. Julia, what are we doing to build more relationships with partner orgs in states? That is Lauren's job. So we work, and especially last year was a big step forward in this. But essentially, we always work with state legislative caucuses in states. So the so-and-so Democratic Party, or the so-and-so House Democratic Campaign Caucus or Campaign Committee. There are a lot of other groups like state donor tables, the Progress Arizonas, the Progress Michigans. They tend to often be on the independent side of the campaign finance wall. But we're doing our best while we can to get to know those folks and figure out how our programs can interact. One thing we have found that is kind of a little bit subtle in doing this kind of work in the context of partner orgs is that we tend to double down on the things that work for us. So it means that we build tons and tons of websites, emails, ads, SMS projects, and those tend to happen directly with campaigns. And so we're laser focused on working with the partners that will enable that work, and where we can get more folks in and aligned with the better. And that's going to be one of the things that we will be working on this upcoming cycle. So with that, I will let everybody go. Thank you so much for joining. Remember, volunteer, refer a friend, donate, just hang out. It's all good. But all of our success is really because of the members of this community, and we couldn't do it without you. So a big thank you from me and the rest of the team. Have a great night.